What happens when a black woman gets arrested? Just for buying books. No yelling, no conflict, just quiet profiling in a quiet city until one mistake, one set of cuffs, and one silent glance changes everything. The officer thought she was just another civilian. Easy to intimidate, easy to forget. What he didn't know was that her husband worked deep inside the federal government. And what neither of them knew was that her story would shake the system from the inside out. This isn't just a tale of one injustice. It's about how dignity under pressure becomes power under purpose, and how one woman's calm refusal to disappear lit the first spark in a city-wide reckoning. Stay with us, because what started in silence ended in reform. The marble floors of the Alexandria District Courthouse echoed with the sharp cadence of polished boots, measured, deliberate, unmistakably rehearsed. Officer Callum Price moved through the building like he owned it. His badge wasn't just clipped to his chest. It sat there like a shield, like proof that in this space he was the final authority. After nearly 15 years in courthouse security, he had learned to spot what he called disruptors before they ever opened their mouths. The loud ones, the defiant ones, the ones, in his mind, who didn't belong. And most often, they looked a certain way. That morning, he'd been assigned to oversee general security outside Courtroom 4A, where a high-profile theft case was set to resume. The defendant was black, and in Callum's world, that already told him enough. As he rounded the corner near the main atrium, something, or someone, caught his eye. A black woman, mid-40s, composed and sharply dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit, walked toward him with a confident gait. Her heels didn't click nervously. Her posture didn't shrink. She moved like someone who had never been told she didn't belong. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. Callum's eyes narrowed. She offered a polite nod as she passed. He didn't return it. Instead, he stepped directly into her path. "Watch it," he snapped, his voice clipped with irritation. The woman paused, unfazed. "Pardon me," she said, voice calm. "I didn't mean to get in your way." But Callum was already frowning. The apology wasn't enough. Not for him, not from her. "Typical," he muttered under his breath. "You people never know your place." The woman's expression didn't shift. There was a brief tightening around her eyes, a flicker of quiet restraint. Then it vanished. "I have business in court," she replied. Callum crossed his arms. "Oh, really? Let me guess. You're here to shout about justice? Here to rally behind your criminal friend?" His smirk widened, expecting defensiveness, perhaps anger. What he got was silence. She stood there, unshaken, her gaze steady but unreadable. That only made him more irritated. "I asked you a question," he said, louder now. Heads began to turn. Staff, interns, even a few early jurors. The tension in the corridor shifted like a thread pulled too tightly. "You don't belong here," Callum said flatly. "This section is restricted. I suggest you leave before you create a scene." "I have every right to be here," she said evenly, her tone quiet but rooted. He stepped forward. "Not on my watch." By now, 2 officers nearby were watching. Callum gestured sharply. "Remove her," he barked. "Now." They hesitated. "Officer Price, maybe we should—" "I said now." And just like that, the situation shifted. The woman didn't resist. She didn't argue. As the officers reached for her arms, she simply looked at Callum one more time. Nothing in her expression except a calmness that cut sharper than any scream. For a moment, he felt a chill in his chest. But he brushed it off. In his mind, she was just another woman who needed to be reminded who was in charge. What he didn't know was that in less than 10 minutes, everything he believed about power, place, and control would begin to collapse, publicly, permanently, and far too late. The marble corridor fell silent as the 2 officers moved hesitantly toward the woman standing between them and Officer Callum Price. They exchanged uneasy glances, not because they feared her, but because something about the moment didn't feel right. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't refused to leave. She'd barely spoken. And yet, her very stillness unsettled them. But Price didn't care. He had given a command, and in his world, commands were not to be questioned. "You heard me," he barked again, sharper this time. "Remove her. She's interfering with a sensitive proceeding." One of the officers stepped forward, hand brushing the side of his holster. Not as a threat, but as habit. The other reached for the woman's arm. She didn't resist. No sharp inhale, no sudden shift, no reaction, just silence. As they took hold of her arms, her body moved with theirs. but not because she was weak, because she was willing, because she had already decided this wasn't the moment to fight. Her calm was louder than any protest. The hallway filled with tension, not noise. Court clerks paused mid-step. A junior prosecutor froze near the stairwell. A law clerk tilted their head slightly, watching with an expression somewhere between concern and disbelief. Callum Price stood tall, arms crossed, a half smirk on his face as the woman was escorted toward the double doors at the end of the hall. "This is how it works," he muttered under his breath. "You walk in here like you own the place, and now you're walking out in cuffs." But she wasn't cuffed, and she wasn't embarrassed. Before she crossed the threshold, she turned her head slightly. Not in protest, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. Her eyes found his. For the briefest second, he expected anger, fury, even fear, but all he saw was stillness, measured, controlled, almost surgical in its precision, and for a split second it unnerved him. But he quickly buried the feeling beneath the same armor he always wore: authority, assumption, and the confidence that no one would question his version of events. The doors swung shut behind her. Price turned back toward the corridor, ready to resume his post, ready to enjoy the murmurs of approval he assumed would follow. But the air had changed. There were no claps on the back, no affirming nods, just silence. And eyes. A few filled with doubt, one or two with quiet judgment. And somewhere near to the end of the hallway, a voice whispered just loud enough to be heard, "She didn't even fight back." Callum straightened his posture and forced a grin, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. To him, this was over. He had shown the courthouse who was in charge, but what he hadn't realized was who he'd just tried to remove, and that oversight, made not from ignorance but from arrogance, was about to crack everything he thought he controlled. The doors had barely swung shut when a voice, calm but carrying unmistakable weight, broke the tension in the corridor. "Officer Price," it said, "do you even realize what you've just done?" Callum Price turned toward the speaker, jaw tight, annoyance already forming behind his eyes. The man standing before him was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit with an attorney's ID badge clipped just below his lapel and a thin folder tucked under his arm. Marcus Ellison. Anyone who had spent time around the Alexandria courthouse knew the name. Civil rights litigator, relentless cross-examiner, a man whose voice had overturned verdicts and cost departments millions. He was respected by some, resented by many, but ignored by no one. Callum tried to steady his tone. "She was obstructing proceedings. She didn't belong in that section." Ellison tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "Didn't belong? That is your assessment?" "I followed protocol," Callum replied, a bit louder now as heads began to swivel toward them again. "No," Marcus said, still calm. "You followed your assumptions. And in doing so, you just forcibly removed one of the most senior national security officials in this country from a federal courthouse." Callum blinked. "What?" Ellison took a slow step forward, not aggressive, just precise. "That woman you had dragged out?" he said. "Her name is Dr. Simone Hayes. She is the Deputy Director of Federal Security, appointed by the President's office, sworn under the Homeland Protection Act, has clearance levels you can't pronounce and jurisdiction that extends far beyond this courthouse." The words hit like concrete dropped into water. "No," Callum said instinctively, his voice suddenly small. "No, that can't be. She didn't identify herself." "She didn't need to," Marcus cut in. "You were too busy trying to prove something to stop and ask." For a moment, the corridor stood still. Then it began. The shift. Officers who had previously turned away now turned back. Clerks stopped mid-step. Two bailiffs at the end of the hallway exchanged glances. The tension wasn't just thick, it was suffocating. Callum's mouth moved, but no words came. His eyes darted toward the courtroom doors, as if Simone Hayes might somehow still be standing there, as if he could undo it. She didn't look like... The sentence never finished. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Didn't look like what?" Silence. Callum's breath quickened. The same badge that had once given him certainty now felt like it was burning through his uniform. Look, I didn't know. This is all a misunderstanding," he muttered, suddenly reaching for something. Anything that might soften what was coming. But Ellison wasn't finished. "You've just assaulted a federal official," he said, "on record, in front of witnesses, and most likely on camera. I suggest you start thinking about legal representation, because what's coming next, He tapped the folder against his palm. "Is bigger than anything you've ever handled." Callum didn't move. He couldn't. For the first time in years, the man who controlled the hallway had nowhere left to stand, and the collapse had only just begun. In the hallway beyond the courtroom doors, Dr. Simone Hayes walked with quiet certainty. She did not call attention to herself. She did not raise her voice. But with a single swipe of her thumb, she unlocked her phone, pressed one contact, and held it to her ear. "This is Hayes," she said, her voice composed. "Immediate response required. Alexandria Courthouse. I've been forcibly removed by an officer. Badge 2917. I want Federal Internal Affairs and a response team on site in 10 minutes. She ended the call. No fury, no drama, just precision. Back in the corridor, Callum Price stood frozen as the echo of her title still rang in his ears. Deputy Director of Federal Security. People had begun whispering. Officers avoided eye contact. The tension he once wielded now worked against him. It had become atmosphere, and he was choking in it. Then a sharp voice boomed from behind. "Officer Price!" The crowd parted. Chief Judge Roland Avery strode down the hall with the kind of presence that didn't require introductions. Late 60s, impeccably groomed, robes crisp, voice unmistakable. "You will report to my chambers immediately," he said, loud enough for every ear in the hall to hear. Callum tried to speak. "Your Honor, Now," the judge snapped, eyes narrowing. The silence that followed was deafening. Court reporters who had previously lingered near the jury room now shifted. Phones lifted. Cameras were turned on, subtle but steady. The hallway was no longer just a corridor. It was a stage. Callum turned to go, but not before someone called out, "Was that really a federal official you dragged out?" The question hung in the air like a knife. A local news stringer in a beige jacket whispered into his phone, "Yeah, Simone Hayes, it's confirmed. They threw out Simone Hayes." Another voice, "Are we rolling?" By the time Callum reached the judge's chambers, he could feel the floor shifting beneath him. He wasn't in control of the story anymore. It was spiraling, fast. Inside the chambers, Judge Avery slammed the door behind them. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said, pacing. Callum tried again. "She didn't identify herself. I thought—" "You thought?" The judge cut him off. "Since when is thinking an excuse for manhandling a federal officer in a public court building in front of witnesses?" "I was just doing my job." "No," the judge said sharply. "You were doing what you always do. Only this time it wasn't someone powerless. And this time, someone was watching." Outside, the story had already started spreading. Within the hour, footage of Simone being escorted out, her face calm, Officer Price glaring, was on social media. The comments came fast and furious. Hashtags followed. Simone Hayes, badge 2917, power checked. Callum's face appeared in still frames across multiple channels. The captions weren't kind. Back in the courtroom wing, officers stared down at their phones, reading updates that made their stomachs twist. Callum sat in the judge's chamber, eyes hollow. He had worn that uniform for 15 years, believed it made him untouchable. But now, as his name trended and his actions were dissected by strangers, he realized something far more dangerous than any suspect had just walked through his hallway. It was accountability. And it was already in the building. The chief judge's chambers were colder than usual, not in temperature, but in tone. Officer Callum Price sat stiffly in the lone chair positioned at the center of the room. The walls, once familiar, now felt like they were inching inward. Surrounding him stood 4 senior court officials, all expressionless. None of them sat. None of them smiled. At the head of the room, Chief Judge Roland Avery removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture less about vision and more about patience wearing thin. "We've received word from the Federal Security Office," he began, voice low. "They've confirmed the identity of the individual you forcibly removed this morning." Callum nodded faintly, sweat forming beneath the collar of his uniform. "Do you understand the magnitude of your actions, Officer Price?" the judge continued, not waiting for an answer. "Do you comprehend what it means to lay hands on a federal official, let alone one with national security clearance?" Callum opened his mouth. "I didn't know who she was. She didn't identify. She didn't need to," came a second voice, firm and cutting. Marcus Ellison had entered the room. He closed the door behind him quietly and stepped forward. A folder tucked under one arm, his expression unreadable. "You didn't stop long enough to ask," he continued, "because you thought you already knew. That's the problem, isn't it?" Callum said nothing. Ellison opened the folder and placed a single sheet of paper on the desk in front of the judge. While everyone's busy reacting to this morning's debacle, he said evenly, I thought it might be helpful to revisit Officer Price's prior complaints. The room shifted. Judge Avery adjusted his posture. What complaints? Another official asked. Ellison raised an eyebrow. You mean you haven't seen them? He slid over a stapled stack of incident reports. 5 separate allegations over 8 years, all involving aggressive conduct, all involving black civilians, traffic stops, courthouse altercations, 1 use of force review that was conveniently closed with insufficient evidence. Callum looked down at his hands. He had assumed those files were forgotten, buried, shielded by the badge he wore. But today had changed something. Today, someone had listened. You were warned before, the judge said, his voice tightening. And still this morning, with cameras rolling, with staff watching, you decided to exert force not because it was required, but because it made you feel in control. Ellison stepped closer, his voice quieter now, but sharper. You didn't just violate procedure. You violated the oath you took when you put on that uniform. To protect, to serve, not to profile, not to punish. Callum's jaw tightened, but no words came. The silence around him wasn't passive. It was judgment. Not loud, not theatrical, just final. One of the senior officers, who had once shared coffee with Callum during morning shifts, crossed his arms. Another, who had covered for him once during an overtime report, now stared at the floor. The room had turned. The institution he thought would insulate him now held him at arm's length. Outside, the media storm was growing. Headlines were shifting from whispers to banners. Federal official forcibly removed in courthouse altercation. Her name was everywhere now. But inside this room, Callum Price's name was shrinking, not erased, but reduced to evidence. He sat there, badge still clipped to his chest, but for the first time in his career, it no longer carried weight. Not far from the courthouse where Officer Callum Price's world was quietly unraveling, another storm was brewing, this one across town, inside the holding wing of Precinct 9. Danielle Rivers sat in a cold metal chair, hands cuffed behind her back. The fluorescent lights above hummed steadily, indifferent to her presence. Her blazer had been taken. Her phone was confiscated. Her wrists, though steady, bore the sharp sting of unnecessary restraint. Her crime? Buying 3 books, 2 on constitutional law and 1 on race, justice, and civic power, while wearing a hoodie and carrying a tote bag. A call from a nervous clerk, a hasty assumption, and an officer with too much confidence and too little context. Now, she was here, alone. Again. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. But deep inside, a familiar ache grew. The ache of being both visible and unseen, overlooked and over-scrutinized, all at once. Down the corridor, a commotion stirred. Footsteps, sharp, heavy. Malcolm Rivers had arrived. He moved like a man who didn't need to announce his presence, because it did the announcing for him. His ID badge, Senior Agent, FBI, swung slightly from his neck as he passed through the front desk without asking for permission. Desk officers stood, startled but frozen. No one stopped him. He reached the duty desk. "Where's Sergeant Knox?" he asked, voice low but precise. A junior officer stammered, briefing room, sir. Why? I'll find him myself." 2 minutes later, Sergeant Bradley Knox looked up from a clipboard to find Malcolm standing in his doorway. The smile on his face faltered. "Agent Rivers, I wasn't expecting—" "You have my wife in custody," Malcolm interrupted, stepping inside. "Her name is Danielle Rivers. She was arrested. For what?" Knox hesitated, flipping through notes. "It's standard procedure. There was a call from a store manager about suspicious behavior. She refused to show ID. She refused to validate a stereotype," Malcolm said flatly. "She had every right to remain silent. She had books in her hand, not contraband, not stolen, just books." Knox cleared his throat. "We were waiting on confirmation." "You're not waiting anymore," Malcolm said. "You're walking down that hall, you're unlocking those cuffs, and you're going to say her name and apologize because that's the bare minimum you owe her." The room fell silent. Then Knox stood. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for backup. He walked. Malcolm followed. They arrived at the holding cell. Danielle was seated exactly where she had been. She didn't look up. "Mrs. Rivers," Knox said, clearing his throat, "you're free to go. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Danielle turned, slow and deliberate. She didn't speak. She simply extended her hands. Knox unlocked the cuffs. She rubbed the red marks on her wrists, then stood, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Malcolm was waiting in the hallway. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. None were needed. Because in that look was a lifetime of shared knowledge, that injustice wasn't always televised and dignity wasn't always loud. But today, the world had seen two names in two places, Dr. Simone Hayes and Danielle Rivers. Both women of quiet strength, both targeted by systems that mistook silence for weakness. And the tide had just begun to turn. The hearing room inside the Alexandria Internal Affairs Division wasn't built for spectacle. It was plain, quiet, sterile. But for Officer Callum Price, it may as well have been a courtroom. Because in that space, surrounded by the Misconduct Review Board, representatives from the city attorney's office, and internal affairs observers, his career was on trial. He sat rigid in his chair, his hands clasped together, knuckles white. No uniform today, just a dark blue blazer that suddenly felt too small, his badge, his belt, his weapon, already surrendered before the hearing even began. Across from him, a panel of 5 reviewed the findings. There was no cross-examination, no theatrics, only documentation, eyewitness testimony, surveillance footage, past complaints, and the one name that couldn't be ignored, Dr. Simone Hayes. When the senior officer at the center of the board finally spoke, the tone was neutral, professional, but unmistakably final. After reviewing the evidence, witness statements, and your history of prior conduct, the board finds you guilty on all counts of procedural misconduct, racial profiling, and use of unauthorized force against a federal official. Silence. Callum didn't blink. Effective immediately, the officer continued, you are hereby dismissed from service, permanently. Another voice added, your right to carry a department-issued weapon is revoked. Your police credentials will be deactivated today. Your name will be added to the state's Officer Decertification Registry. Each sentence fell like the last ticks of a clock winding down. He felt them all. There were no arguments, no rebuttals. Even Callum understood by now. This wasn't a moment to fight. That moment had passed the second he put his hands on a woman he never bothered to ask the name of. A junior staff member stepped forward with a small gray box. Inside, his badge, his nameplate, a department-issued pen, and the last pieces of identity he had tied to something bigger than himself. Callum opened the box, looked down, then closed it. He stood slowly, gripping the edges of the cardboard as if it might steady him. No one rose to follow him. No one offered a word. As he walked down the corridor toward the exit of the precinct, a building he'd entered for over a decade with pride, he passed rows of desks that used to feel like family. Now, eyes averted, chairs shifted, a few monitors flickered with news articles already bearing his name. He reached the front lobby. No applause, no protest, just a reporter quietly waiting outside, scribbling into a notebook. Do you regret it? She asked. Callum paused, lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. He stepped into the sunlight, blinking hard against it. The city looked the same, but something inside him had changed, not because he had learned, but because the world had made it impossible not to feel the weight of consequence. The sun was high over Alexandria Police Headquarters, casting long shadows across the concrete steps. Callum Price stood just beyond the front entrance, the gray box still in his hands. Inside it lay the last fragments of an identity he had built his life around. A badge that once gave him authority, and now only reminded him of what he'd lost. For the first time in his career, no one was watching his back. No radios chirped his name, no doors opened at his presence, no one saluted. There was only silence. He took a step toward the sidewalk and stopped. The city looked the same, buses passing, pedestrians pacing with coffee in hand, courthouse flags swaying in rhythm with the wind. But to Callum, the world had shifted beneath him, and he was the only one left unbalanced. He thought back to the moment in the hallway, the sharp click of his boots, the sense of control, the way he'd stared down a composed black woman without hesitation, convinced he had every right to, because for years he had been protected, by the silence of his peers, by the blind trust that came with a uniform, by the assumption that his version of events would always win. That assumption was now shattered. He glanced down at his hands. They weren't shaking, but they didn't feel steady either. The box felt heavier than it should have, not because of the objects inside, but because of what they represented. A career built on power, not service. A pattern of decisions he'd never questioned, and a belief that consequence was something that happened to other people. Now there were no more excuses. He remembered the judge's words, the board's verdict, Marcus Ellison's stare, and most of all, Dr. Simone Hayes's silence, that calm, unblinking gaze that had pierced through his performance of authority like a needle through fabric. He had looked at her and seen someone to remove. She had looked at him and seen someone who would remove himself, and she'd been right. He turned away from the building. There were no cameras today. No viral video waiting to capture his next move. Just a man walking down a sidewalk he once drove past with impunity, now reduced to one footstep at a time. As he reached the end of the block, he paused and looked back. Not for closure, but for confirmation. The doors he once entered daily now stood behind him, closed and unfamiliar. They no longer opened for him. They no longer belonged to him. And for the first time in a long time, he understood the true meaning of accountability. His badge hadn't made him untouchable. It had only delayed the inevitable. The video began as a shaky 6-second clip. No audio, just a grainy hallway. 2 uniformed officers, a black woman, seated, cuffed, surrounded. And a title, Arrested for Buying Books, Alexandria, 2025. Within hours it spread. Within days it ignited. Danielle Rivers never intended to become a symbol. But symbols aren't chosen. They emerge from silence that lasts too long. And an audience finally ready to listen. Her story, once whispered in a quiet holding cell, was now spoken on stages. Danielle didn't scream. She didn't rage. When she stood at the podiums of law schools, policy forums, or student conferences, she didn't tell people how to feel. She simply told them what happened. I walked into a bookstore. I bought 3 books. I was followed. I was questioned. I was arrested. I was never asked what I was reading. The rooms grew quiet. Every time. She paused when needed, spoke when it mattered, and always ended with the same line. I wasn't the first. If we don't change this, I won't be the last. People listened, not because she dramatized, but because she didn't have to. Her dignity, sharp, measured, undeniable, cut through headlines and talking points like truth through fog. Students stood in line just to thank her. Educators changed their curriculum. Nonprofits reached out, asking her to sit on advisory boards. Civil rights organizations offered platforms, but Danielle made it clear this wasn't about a moment, it was about a movement. Meanwhile, Malcolm Rivers worked in quieter corridors. Inside the bureau, he drafted memos, initiated policy audits, and met with oversight committees. He pushed for expanded field training on implicit bias, deeper screening on misconduct records, and an internal task force that reported directly to civilian review boards. Some resisted, most just watched. But his resolve was constant. When colleagues asked what fueled him, he never mentioned titles. He never referenced rank. He just said, "Her name is Danielle. She deserved better. They all do." Back home, their house became a place of reflection and forward motion. Danielle spent her evenings combing through community stories, replying to women from across the country who had experienced the same quiet violations. Each message read like a variation of her own. Too black, too confident, too smart, too present. But now, they weren't alone, because Danielle refused to stay silent. And in her voice, others found their own. Her legacy wasn't one of outrage, it was one of awakening. And for every person who once believed that injustice could be contained to a room, a badge, or a single misstep, Danielle Rivers became the reminder that silence has limits, and she had just redrawn them. The press conference was held in the City Council rotunda, under a vaulted ceiling that had witnessed decades of handshakes, ribbon cuttings, and ceremonial speeches. But this time, the room carried a different weight. This time, it was about reckoning. Effective immediately, the mayor began, the city of Alexandria is enacting a comprehensive series of police reforms aimed at accountability, community trust, and the dismantling of systemic bias. The policies weren't symbolic, they were structural. Mandatory bias de-escalation training for all law enforcement staff, an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power, real-time misconduct flagging systems tied to officer evaluation, public transparency reports released quarterly, community-led hiring panels to review applicants for sensitivity and integrity. At the center of it all was a name etched in both policy and principle, Danielle Rivers. The mayor paused, lifting a folder with her case transcript clipped inside. This began not with outrage, he said, but with a moment. A moment where a woman, calm, composed, and in handcuffs, refused to shrink. In the audience, Danielle sat quietly, wearing a cream blazer and a silver pin in the shape of an open book. Next to her, Malcolm Rivers remained still, but his hand rested gently over hers. Behind them stood activists, students, community leaders, and dozens of others whose voices had once been sidelined, but now echoed through marble corridors once silent to their truths. Danielle hadn't come for the spotlight. She didn't crave titles or awards. What she had always wanted, was clarity and change. And change had come, not easily, not without resistance, but undeniably. After the conference, cameras followed her down the steps of City Hall. A reporter called out, "Mrs. Rivers, how does it feel knowing your story helped change city policy?" Danielle stopped, turned. "It shouldn't take going viral to be treated like a human being," she said. "But if my voice helped others be heard, then it was worth it. This isn't just about me. It's about every woman who's ever been questioned, doubted, dismissed, simply for being present." Then she walked on. Later that week, students at Alexandria University gathered under a mural newly painted across the side of the law school building. It showed Danielle in profile, calm, strong, uncuffed. Beneath the image, a quote, "Silence does not protect justice, it protects power." The legacy of Danielle Rivers wasn't one of rage, it was one of resistance without spectacle, of being measured without being small, of proving that sometimes the most powerful protest is simply refusing to disappear. Her story became case study. Her name became precedent. Her voice, once quieted by metal restraints, now lived in policies, classrooms, protests, and reforms across the state. She had not chosen this fight, but she had finished it with grace. And in doing so, she reminded an entire city what justice looks like. Not when it arrives with noise, but when it endures in truth. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks into a courtroom, calm and cuffed, and walks out rewriting the rules. Danielle Rivers didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. She didn't fight back with fists. She fought back with presence, patience, and truth. Her story reminds us that resistance doesn't always look like a protest. Sometimes it looks like a woman refusing to bow her head, and a system finally forced to look itself in the mirror. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated, hit the like button to make sure others hear it too. Share this video with someone who believes quiet dignity has no power, and let Danielle prove them wrong. Comment below if you've ever witnessed injustice in silence. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that challenge power and inspire change. Because here we don't just tell stories, we amplify the ones the world tries to silence.